The second meeting of the newly formed Yes Eastwood group. You're all very welcome. I know there's lots of people who have travelled quite a distance to come here tonight, and hopefully it will be really enjoyable for you. A quick word about what we're trying to achieve here, because when the panel was announced, it's fair to say we had a couple of comments, but 99% of them were supportive, and in fact we have had loads of other Yes groups emailing and saying this is what we should be doing, because if independence is a debate, we have to be listening to all sides of the argument. We don't just want to sit in a room talking to ourselves, telling ourselves how wonderful we are. So just to be clear, each speaker here tonight is going to speak for 15 minutes, then we're going to have a break for tea and coffee, and then we're going to have a question and answer session, which will be done by the drawing of lots. To be completely fair, there will be a number that you can take during the interval, and we will draw the numbers out and go through as many questions as possible. All I would wish to point out is that Yes Eastwood has a zero tolerance to any abusive behaviour, any bad language being used. Robust questioning is fine, but let's keep it polite and respectful to everybody's views. That's all we ask. So, as I say, each speaker is going to speak for 15 minutes, and first up tonight is Kirsten Oswald.
Independence, and that's a bit of an admission for me, because I grew up in a very independently minded house with two SNP activist parents, but like so many people my age, if I thought about it at all, I thought it wasn't for us. How could we possibly manage Scotland to go it alone? It was all a bit pie in the sky. So I went about my business, and as I grew up, I was a fervent Labour voter. I knew that was where my politics lay. And I only eventually joined the SNP in 2014, although, to be fair, my voting pattern had changed a bit before that. So I think for me, and a lot of my peers are similar, that this dawning realisation that I really wanted to see an independent Scotland took a while, because the political narrative, what I read and what I saw in the years that were formative for me, independence just didn't factor at all. And, thinking about that, people will have views, and, perhaps David will cover this, I don't know, about how things are presented in the media now. But one thing's for sure, I don't think any of our young people today will think that independence isn't an option for them. I don't think that any of them will think that that isn't something that they have an opportunity to have their say on. So I'd never claimed that Scotland is special. Obviously it's special to me, but what I mean when I think that is that I don't think that we are intrinsically suited any better than anyone else to going down any particular path. We're not any better suited to a course of action than any other country. But of course, we're clearly not any worse either. We're no less capable than anyone else. So on a really fundamental level, there's obviously no reason at all why we wouldn't be able to make a success of running our own affairs, making the decisions that suit us best. As things stand, we can't do that. There is a democratic deficit, if you like, simply because our neighbours in England are so much bigger. I suppose it's simply a matter of scale. And having spent these couple of years in Westminster, I have to tell you, that's not going to change. The system there, the structures that work in Westminster are designed to perpetuate a norm. They're designed to make sure that the system is cemented, if you will, and to divert change from happening. So that's not going to move. And among all of that, Westminster simply isn't focused on Scotland. It doesn't work for Scotland. And that makes me reflect on the morning after the 2014 referendum, and I was heart sore, and I put the television on, and David Cameron came out onto the steps outside 10 Downing Street and made a speech. And I thought that speech was completely off beam. He spoke about how he felt there was a need for English votes for English laws. Now, I think there is a real argument for an English Parliament within the current structure. But for me, that day, and what he said showed that the focus Scotland was going to need just wasn't there. So we need to change things. I think we need a democracy that hears us, whatever our voices are, and I know that they aren't all the same, But Westminster isn't going to provide that, so that means that Scotland loses out. And I have to tell you that if you'd said to me maybe even 10 years ago that I would be coming here and I'd be standing saying this, I would have thought that was a bit unlikely, perhaps a little bit reactionary, a wee bit rebellious. And, you know, realistically, I can see looking back why I might have thought that. You know, I'm a middle-aged, I guess now, middle class, probably, woman from a comfortable suburban household. But the things that I think are pretty mainstream these days, it's pretty straightforward to think that we can do better. And whatever our backgrounds, wherever we've come from, whatever our views, I think that there is a growing understanding of the merits of making our own decisions. Now, I really don't want to be partisan tonight. I don't think that's helpful, and you all know my views anyway, so this is certainly not a commentary on parties. But it's more about how, if we were able to look at everything from a new perspective, from a new centre of gravity, if you like, then we might make different choices. For example, on immigration. So nobody who knows anything about my beliefs will be surprised that that's what I have landed on as an issue that I would want to talk about. And evidently immigration's a political hot potato at the moment. We heard Jeremy Corbyn talking about it in Dundee last week. But you know, it shouldn't be a hot potato at all. Scotland needs immigration. Scotland wants immigrants. Immigrants don't depress wages, whatever other people say. Unscrupulous bosses. Unscrupulous bosses and bad politics is what depresses people's wages. So people that come to our country to live here, to work here, to settle here, to make their families here, they are us. They're Scottish, just in the same way that I'm Scottish. And these new Scots have got absolutely the same stake in our country as anyone who can trace their family back generations here. So we're a diverse wee country, and we're increasingly diverse, and we should have confidence in that. And that all matters to me on a very personal level, because I'm part of a mixed-race family. But obviously, while I'm pushing for a more tolerant, diverse society, where we do value difference because of that, I think it rings true for all of us. This should matter to all of us. As a country, Scotland benefits from being a diverse place, from being deliberately outward-looking, from engaging with different places and different people. And that, very unsurprisingly, brings me on to Brexit. Now, obviously, I felt very strongly in 2014 that Scotland should be independent, and the time was right for that to happen. And I feel that all the more strongly now. The arguments for yes in 2014 still hold true. But now, after the Brexit vote and the shambles of a failure to plan, to discuss, just a total vacuum at the heart of everything that's come before and after, I actually find it difficult to express in words how disgraceful I think the approach to Brexit has been at every stage by the Westminster parties. And again, I hope that that's not taken to be a political point, because I certainly don't want it to be. Actually, I think that the Scottish Parliament has taken a different approach across the board. But I do genuinely despair at what's been going on or not going on in Westminster. It's been a total abdication of responsibility and leadership. And I think that's a real contrast to the Independence White Paper. Now, whether or not you agreed with the plan that was laid out in the White Paper, there very clearly was a plan. There was forethought, and there was the opportunity to consider what had been set out. In the EU referendum, there was a bus. There was a bus with lies written on the side of it, and a horrible tone of xenophobia, which was really unfortunate. And apart from that, there's been nothing. And in the intervening period, there's been nothing. It's clear that the only thing we've seen, to me, is lies and evasion. And the way that the whole episode has been handled, almost as much as the issue of Brexit itself, makes it all the clearer to me that independence is the way forward. Now, I don't want to be pulled out of the EU. That's not what I want for my family. It's not what Scotland voted for either. And it's certainly not what folk around here voted for. I don't know if people are aware of the vote tallies here, but East Renfrewshire people voted, if you tally up vote share and turnout, more than anywhere else in the UK, I think, to stay within the EU. And this is a surprisingly diverse wee place. There are ties here, really firm ties across the world and across Europe, but also. And this inward looking back to the glory days that never were, Brexit, doesn't sit right here, and it doesn't do us any favours either. So I think we all stand to lose out big time if we're pulled out of Europe, and that means for me we do need to look again at the alternative, and that alternative is an independent Scotland. We need to be able to make our own choices based on what people here need and what people here want. And we did see another way set out in the Scotland's Place in Europe document that the Scottish Government published. But although the UK Government have moved forward slightly, they seem not to be interested in that particular angle and are now looking to use Brexit as a way to remove or grab powers from the Scottish Parliament. And the same is true of Wales as well. And the House of Lords is the way that that's to be achieved. Now, we're not actually at the end of that particular road yet, so we will see what happens going forward. But in any case, whatever happens going forward, there's no doubt that change is coming. So whether people like it or not, that's what's happening. And I don't know exactly what's going to come next. Nobody does, to be honest. But we do know that the status quo is not going to be an option this time. There is no status quo down the track for people. So it looks like our choice is the Brexit option with a race to the bottom and the erosion of the democratic structures we have in Scotland, or the opportunity to build a country that reflects who we are and who we want to be, with the decisions made closer to home and with a confidence in our abilities, as all countries should have. And as for these other countries, well, Scotland's a small northern European nation, and unlike the challenges the UK is facing with its relationships with EU countries, and I'm not referring to the issue with Russia here, I have to say that I do believe that Scotland would have a warm welcome as an independent nation in Europe. And it's interesting, the World Economic Forum recently produced a list of inclusive economies, and these small northern European countries, our neighbours, featured very strongly. Norway was at the top of the list, Iceland, Ireland, Denmark, Sweden, they were all in the top 10. So these neighbours, these countries, are there for us to look at when we decide how do we want to build the nation that we want to be. And I think looking internationally, it's pretty safe to imagine that an independent Scotland wouldn't seek to project power around the world in the way that the UK state does, and that is a defined aim that it has, whether that's by working on arms sales with Saudi Arabia or spending billions of pounds on weapons of mass destruction that endanger all of us with no perceptible military benefit. And having spent that couple of years looking at issues to do with defence and the armed forces, it strikes me that independence is a chance for us to look again in that area and look at what do we want from defence, how do we want our forces to operate, what do we expect of them? Because we do occupy that very important strategic position in the north. So that does give us the opportunity to work with others in this area, to look at this part of the world, but also to look more broadly across the world and think of the opportunities with peacekeeping, with reconstruction, and less of the opportunity of the military swagger that the UK is so keen to push for, but that does so little in terms of actually defending anybody. And that's just one example, of course, of the choices that an independent Scotland could make, how we shape our country, the decisions in every area of our life could be made in a new Scottish context with a different frame of reference. And so as that's true in defence, it's also true, for instance, in energy. Think of the immense potential that Scotland has to be a global leader in renewables. It's all about making these choices and resetting that centre of gravity. And the same could be true for the economy, for food and drink, for immigration. Because fundamentally, no matter what the issue, I know independence wouldn't be a magic wand for Scotland, but I've no doubt that if our centre of gravity was here in Scotland, if that's where our perspective was, if that is where we were focused, then the choice we make would be more fixed on the people who live here, their needs and their priorities. I think people deserve better than the constraints of Westminster. It's not fit for the purpose that we need it to do. It's remote in every way, and it's not delivering for the people in Scotland. So I do hope that we get the opportunity to think again, to decide what future we want to see for Scotland, and I hope that this time we grab it with both hands. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kirsten. Okay, please give a warm Eastwood welcome to David Torrance.
Hello, good evening. I thought I'd start just by setting out some things that I do believe and I don't believe. I mean, perhaps all of you don't know my work. I'm a columnist with the Herald, sometime pundit on various outlets, and the author of a number of books on Scottish politics. I'm just conscious that, certainly judging from the Twitter sphere and the blogosphere, that there's a certain view of where I'm coming from, which I thought it might be useful to put right. So first off, and believe it or not, I'm not anti-independence. If a country, if a sizable body of public opinion, if a majority of voters want independence in whatever context, then I think it's pretty pointless to be against that once it gets to that stage. What I'm skeptical of is the case for independence as stated in 2014. Kirsten referred to the white paper, a very lengthy white paper. I wrote a lot about that at the time, and I was skeptical, deeply skeptical, and I remain so about many of the arguments within the white paper and put forward more broadly by the Yes campaign at the time. I don't think independence would be a disaster. I think, as Kirsten said, it's perfectly workable. I don't remember many people making the contrary argument a few years ago, and I certainly don't believe that now. But nor do I think it would be easy. And again, I think there's probably a degree of common ground on both of those points. I don't think the Union is perfect. Few multinational states are. They are imperfect, at a certain level, artificial entities. I am a federalist, for what it's worth. That's used to be a very Lib Dem niche concern, but I've written a lot about that. That to me offers a sort of more realistic and practical roadmap for the United Kingdom. Of course, there are problems with that. There are problems with all these options. I'm also not a Tory, but I do have a background in the party. I was a member at university. I worked for a member of parliament. But my views have shifted over time. It's said that people get more conservative with age. With me, if anything, it's the opposite. I'll give you a few examples. I'm for a greater redistribution of wealth. One of the few sort of overtly pro-SNP, pro-Scottish Government articles I wrote recently was about the income tax changes. I think changes to Scotland's fiscal regime are long overdue, and a modest increase in income tax is perfectly justifiable. In fact, I'd like to see it go much further. I'm also against Trident. I've written about this. It doesn't tend to get much attention. I think the argument for a nuclear deterrent is pretty weak. It's neither a deterrent nor is the sheer cost really justifiable. And it is, as Kirsten alluded to, a sort of rather pathetic relic of a certain view of Britishness as having a global clout, which in reality it lost about half a century ago. I'm also skeptical about the case for austerity. The economics of that, Craig is probably better qualified to commentate on that than me, but there's never been a clear empirical basis for austerity economics. I think Brexit is nuts, but at the same time, and going back to my first point, I think when you have a democratic majority, and it was always pitched as a UK-wide referendum, Jim Sillars has made this point, you have to respect that, like it or not. Just as if there'd been a majority yes vote in 2014, I would not have argued for rerunning that, revisiting it, watering it down, or whatever. I just don't think you can do that with referendums, let alone elections. Skepticism, I refer to skepticism. It's legitimate to be skeptical about the case for independence. It's legitimate to be skeptical about Brexit. It's legitimate to be skeptical about austerity. It's legitimate to be skeptical about Jeremy Corbyn, and I am skeptical about all these things. It's a vital part of journalism. It's a crucial part of democracy and free discourse. And just quite a lot of the time, and I say this gently, the independence debate is conducted in terms which certainly appears to give the impression that it doesn't quite respect alternative views, doesn't respect skepticism. I think doubt is good. We need more of it. Admitting to mistakes, admitting that there are strengths and weaknesses in the Union, in the case for independence, in all parties and none. Arguments for independence. It seems to me that there's two ways of arguing for this, and I think this was clarified a few years ago. You can either argue an in-principle case. So, for example, Alex Salmond, when he was First Minister a few years ago, used to say, when asked, why do you support independence, he would say, Scotland is a nation, and I believe that nations should govern themselves. That is a sort of existential argument. It's self-contained. It doesn't need any further elaboration. The other way to approach this is the policy-based case. It is saying independence will give rise to social justice, independence will reduce inequality, and so on and so forth. That's the sort of utilitarian argument. Nicola Sturgeon made a speech at Strathclyde University a few years ago which separated it in those terms. Now, number one, the in-principle case, is very hard to argue against, actually. You would have to argue that Scotland wasn't a nation, which it clearly is, and you would have to argue that it shouldn't govern itself to some degree. That is also very hard. The second approach, I think, is not impossible, but it becomes a bit problematic, because as soon as you bundle up independence with certain policy outcomes, it makes it much easier for your opponents to rebut it. You know, they can say, well, it wouldn't reduce inequality, it wouldn't necessarily give rise to social justice. And actually, in reality, you cannot guarantee it would do any of those things. And so what happened a few years ago is that those two approaches sort of got bundled up, and it became, I think, for a lot of voters, a bit confusing. So one of the arguments was, well, Scotland will be free to make its own policy choices. That can be decided after independence, which appeared to suggest a sort of existential case. But then, on the other hand, Alex Salmond and others said, but Trident will definitely be banned, and independent Scotland will be nuclear free. Now, the opinion polling actually shows that Scots are kind of split down the middle on that point. But what if you're pro-independence and also pro-Trident? And admittedly, there probably aren't very many people like that. But the point is, you cannot argue on the one hand, we're free to make whatever decision we want, and then on the other hand say, but it has to be a certain course, it has to follow a certain path. I think that is a bit muddled. So this is the bit where I try to give you advice, and again, you might be cynical about that. But if there is a second referendum, and it seems likely there will be, I don't think before 2021, but certainly at some point after, the best argument for independence is that Scotland would be free to make its own decisions. But I think you have to recognise that that has to be qualified. No nation, however big, however small, is sort of completely free, completely sovereign to make whatever decision it wants. It's necessarily constrained by size, by geography, by whatever international partnerships they have, and that would be true of Scotland. And actually Brexit reveals this. For all the dreams of Brexiteers about trading with the world and global Britain and Empire 2.0, the reality of that is markedly different from the rhetoric. So I think there's a need for realism. I think voters respond better to realistic arguments. The economic case is crucial in that sense. Kirsten didn't mention economics at all, but it is front and centre. All the polling data shows you that is one of the biggest factors in terms of how voters make a decision. And 4 years ago, I think the economic case was weak in certain respects, and now I think it's even weaker, even with Brexit. The currency question still has to be resolved. Monetary policy, and the past 10 years reveals this, is hugely important. Control over monetary policy can't just be ceded to London, to the Bank of England, as if it doesn't matter. It matters hugely, especially in how countries respond to economic turbulence. And also negotiations. The white paper, I think, said that it would all be wrapped up in 18 months and it would go quite well. Brexit, again, reveals that that is highly optimistic. And Brexit, at the end of the day, ought to be more straightforward. The UK is leaving a union it's only been in for more than 4 decades. The relationship between Scotland and the rest of the UK is much deeper, much more complicated than that. Self-awareness. I was speaking to one of Nicola Sturgeon's special advisors a few months ago, and he said something very interesting. I won't name him. He said that he'd come to appreciate that the way in which some Brexiteers come across, a bit obsessed, simplistic, and slightly blinkered. He'd come to appreciate that that is how some yes supporters came across to no voters. And I thought that was a very interesting admission. And I'd spoken to him many times about this, and he'd always rejected that, but his view had changed. And I think you have to deal with that. An argument which seems self-evidently strong and good and true to you does not necessarily come across in that way to other people, especially those who have some doubts, who are skeptical. And simply being told endlessly that they are wrong or misguided or whatever is not really a very good way to approach that. I mean, I remember there was a line from the indie ref, especially on Twitter, "Are you yes yet?" And on one level that was quite sort of punchy and amusing, but on another it came across, I think, as hectoring, preachy, and a bit sort of intolerant, the sort of implicit expectation that eventually everyone would come around to the same point of view. Ricky Ross, the singer and musician, wrote quite an interesting piece in the Herald a few weeks ago, which I urge you to track down, where he talks about his own self-perception and how he'd come to appreciate that arguments he made during the independence referendum were not as sort of self-evidently as persuasive as he thought they were at that time. And in a second independence referendum, and as I say, I think that's likely at some stage, I think that's going to be even more important. So to wrap up, I think a second independence referendum is eminently winnable. I've always thought that. There are certain weaknesses in the Unionist, in the contrary case, which I think they kind of papered over the last time, but wouldn't be so easy to do next time. There's a poll today that shows you that I think there's a majority amongst the under 55s. Even younger voters are even more decisively in favour of independence. That is a huge strategic strength for the yes side. But at the same time, Brexit, and Kirsten referred to this, Brexit has fascinatingly revealed a split within Scotland and within the yes movement, which I don't think was at all obvious before. And that represents a huge strategic challenge for, not just for the SNP, for the yes movement more broadly. Without that chunk of people, I call them yes leavers, people who voted yes in 2014, but also voted to leave the European Union in 2016. Without them, there does not exist a clear majority for independence. Until and if the First Minister can find some way of reconciling that group to her plan for the European Union, that will remain a huge challenge. So independence is winnable, but that's only half the battle. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. I'd now like to introduce to you Craig Dale.
I always cause trouble for the audio guys. Now, some of you who have maybe seen some of my talks before, you'll know that I'm far more comfortable when I've got a nice projector and lots of graphs and spreadsheets. Happiness is a well-formatted spreadsheet to me. I'm that boring. So this is kind of me, unplugged acoustic version, Craig. I don't know. It also doesn't help that David's stolen quite a few of my points unintentionally. unintentionally. But this is good. So, yeah, David was saying there that independence is eminently winnable, but it's only half the battle. And it does lead into kind of what I wanted to talk to. When I was invited here, I kind of expected that the other three panellists would be talking around that question of should Scotland be an independent country. And I wanted to take a slightly different approach to things, because I wanted to ask the question, what next? Because I'm sure we all remember that day after the EU referendum, when Michael Gove and Boris Johnson stood up on their victor's podium with a look of horror and shock on their face, as if they were definitely thinking it themselves. What now? What next? Commonweal's been trying to approach this for the last 18 months. We developed a project called the White Paper Project, which was taking the arguments from the independence campaign and being self-critical, looking at the ones that either didn't work then or, because of things have changed, don't work now. Also looking at the bits in the white paper that were probably more, I mean, it's probably fair to say that at least half of that Scotland's Future white paper was an SNP manifesto, the policy. And David's right, we can't really pin too much policy onto independence because, that's for party politics afterwards. But there is a lot to do. And it's not going to be easy, but I would also qualify by saying there's a difference between the things that are going to be hard and the things that are going to be difficult. Grabbing a shovel and digging a deep hole is hard, it's hard work, but it's not particularly a challenging task. Building a complex machine might take a lot less effort, but it's quite difficult to do. Similarly, there's certain things that an independent Scotland's going to need, certain institutions. We're going to need a new civil service. We might want to launch a new currency, a new central bank. We might want to talk about citizenship, constitutions, customs and borders. That's just the C's. So, Commonweal tried to produce papers over the last 18 months that tackles a lot of these problems. And we think we've made a reasonable effort. But go onto our website and allofusfirst.org and you can download them and you can read them for yourself. And just in the last few months, we've pulled all those papers together and we've produced a new book. I'm going to plug it here. I have it here. How to Start a New Country, which takes us on that journey, that what next journey. Takes us on 18 months to negotiate independence was a very ambitious timetable. It was predicated on Scotland and the rest of the UK sharing a lot of difficult tasks, like our currency, like a lot of our civil service. And you can make economic and political arguments in favour of that. Certainly at the time, I don't think now, but at the time, the economics of a currency union was arguable. You could argue for that. But the politics of a lot of these questions is just as important. No matter how compelling the economics of that particular policy was, George Osborne could say no. He could veto it. You can then argue, and we did argue in 2014, but he'll change his mind, he'll come to the negotiating table. We all remember again, just before the EU referendum, when the same man stood up and said he would bring down a fire and fury austerity budget if we voted leave. What did he do instead? He quit and ran away. But we can't fight a campaign hoping for that to happen. So a good part of this book, a lot of it's as policy neutral as we can be. We want to build a civil service, but we're not telling it specifically what to do. But we also want to make it as self-reliant as possible. We're not saying cut Scotland off. We're not saying Scotland will not cooperate on anything. But we give it the option to, if it wants to. But we're also not, leaving the veto in someone else's hands. So we've said we're going to take a step back and we're going to say a 3-year process between a yes vote and formal independence. And this is largely based on basically the slowest and most difficult task, which would probably be setting up a new currency. It took about 3 years to launch the euro. And we actually, when we wrote a paper on how to set up a currency, we actually spoke to people who were involved in that process. So this book, it takes you on that timeline. You know, takes you through all the milestones of when we need to start setting up the various institutions and who we need to hire. One of the things we probably didn't make as much of a point of in the last campaign is when you're setting up a new institution in Scotland, like a civil service. That means quite a lot of very skilled jobs being created in Scotland and the opportunities that come with that. So, going to be honest, I'm actually much more interested in hearing you than hearing me. So I kind of want to get onto the Q&A as quickly as possible. So I'm going to shut up now. All I'll say is, beyond that, I do have about a dozen copies of the book with me. If anyone wants to buy one, come up and see me at the end. If not, you can buy them on the website. And I'm looking forward to hearing some of your questions. So, thank you.
Thank you, Craig. And please put your hands together for Alan Bissett.
My guess is that if we vote to stay, we will be in the heady position of the spouse who looked like walking out, but decided to give things one last go. I doubt whether we will ever have been more popular or in a better position to dictate terms than if we vote to stay. Name that tune. J.K. Rowling. Right, I'm going to be generous there and presume that was naive rather than any attempt to deceive. One of the things that's happened since the referendum, and it's happened this evening, is that the 2014 case for yes has been forensically picked apart, and maybe that's necessary. But one of the strengths that we have, one of the greatest arguments that's going to go in our favour the next time, and one of the things that has to happen on a daily basis, is that the no case in 2014 should be forensically picked apart, because no prevailed. No prevailed, and we are now living in the Scotland that was heralded by that vote. And as far as I'm concerned, they've got off scot-free. They've got off scot-free. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at the case against independence that was presented by the No campaign in 2014. And by the end of it, we'll see that it's in tatters. The case for the Union is in tatters. Let's start with the big one, EU membership. The only way of safeguarding Scotland's EU membership is by voting no. We don't have to spend a great deal of time on that one, obviously. One of the big arguments against independence has been the size of Scotland's deficit. Well, first of all, we should be stopping to asking, where did this deficit come from? Because it wasn't run up by the Scottish Government. That's for sure. If being in the Union is such a positive for Scotland, why do we have such an enormous deficit? Whose watch did that happen on? There's the elephant in the room right there. Norway, obviously, discovered oil at the same time as Scotland did. A country with a similar population, similar geography to Scotland, has some of the strongest public finances in the world, but we have this enormous deficit. That is a case against the Union. That's not a case against independence. But even given that, we've already seen that the economic damage that's going to befall Scotland as a result of Brexit is larger than the size of the deficit which Scotland supposedly has at the moment. So we're already in a better place if we choose to become independent than we would be if we stayed in the Union. Jobs. That was one of the big arguments against independence, especially from Labour. Protect jobs. Protect HMRC jobs. Protect jobs in the steel industry. Protect jobs in the shipyards. How did that pan out? HMRC in Cumbernauld shut. Steel yards shut. Shipyards, the frigate orders reduced. All of these promises meant nothing. Absolutely nothing, as we've seen. Renewable energy. Scotland could only protect its renewable energy through the subsidies that were coming from Westminster. Those subsidies have now been cut because they know that renewable energy is Scotland's future and that we have enormous potential in renewable energy, and that when the oil runs out, that is what we're going to need to replace it. And we'd be in a very, very strong position industrially and economically if we invested in renewable energy. And they know this. So what they need to do in order to weaken the case for independence is to weaken Scotland itself. And that's why they've cut subsidies for renewable energy. Again, one of the arguments that I heard a great deal from Labour types was that we're narrow nationalists. These are nothing but nationalists. And my question would be, well, what do you mean by that? What is a nationalist in your definition? Oh, a nationalist. It's a nationalist, isn't it? No, you tell me. What's a nationalist? As a nationalist, somebody believes that, a nation should make its own political and economic decisions insofar as it can. If so, then sure, I am a nationalist. Because there are different types of nationalism, as we know. There's imperialist nationalism, which is belligerent and aggressive and very often xenophobic. And there's anti-imperialist nationalism. And I would certainly never have attached myself to the Yes case if I believed that the sort of nationalism that I was going to attach myself to was the first kind, that was belligerent, that was xenophobic, and that wanted Scotland to become a parochial backwater in the vein that Brexit will lead Britain to become a parochial backwater. Now, let's look at some facts here. Scotland voted Remain. All the pro-independence parties are pro-immigration and pro-EU. A higher proportion of yes voters voted for Remain than no voters. This is the internationalist movement. This is Scotland's internationalist movement right here. Because what are we hearing? What are we hearing? For Jeremy Corbyn, we're hearing anti-immigration arguments. We're hearing that foreign workers depress wages. If we'd come out with that during 2014, they would have crucified us. Of course they would have. But because Corbyn's a socialist, he gets a free pass. He actually came out and said, well, we can reinvest the money that we send to the EU, we can reinvest that in Britain. The money that we send to them, that's not an internationalist argument. Where's the pooling and sharing of resources there? This is an outward-looking, modern, progressive movement, and always has been as far as I'm concerned. Devolution, right, okay, so Gordon Brown was given an hour of prime-time television to make his pitch to the electorate. I can't remember Alex Salmond ever being given that, but okay, he paced up and down and he told us that we would get better, faster change if we voted no. He told us that we would get as close to federalism as was possible within, what was the exact quote, when 80% of the population is out with Scotland. That 80% is the clue. The fact that Scotland only represents 20% of the UK population is the reason why federalism can't work, because that structural imbalance there cannot be got around within the Union. England will always be able to outvote Scotland. Scotland will never be able to have a veto on anything that happens at a governmental level in the UK. And where is this federalism that was promised to us? Do we live in a federal UK now? No. That was an explicit promise made. That was an explicit promise made by a backbench MP who had absolutely no authority to promise us. He wasn't the Prime Minister at the time. That's why David Cameron sent him out to do that, plausible deniability. Because Cameron could go, well, I didn't promise it. It was Gordon Brown. He's got nothing to do with me. Why was David Cameron not making that promise? None of these things were picked apart at the time by the media that were giving us a laser scrutiny in every single utterance that we made. None of this was given any sort of scrutiny whatsoever, and we're now living with the consequences. The vow, right, okay. A piece of mock parchment on the front of a tabloid newspaper is not a legal document. That should be evident to anybody. And within about 6 months, every single one of the people who'd signed that, Clegg, Cameron Miliband had quit the scene. There we are. But essentially the vow was vague, the vow was insubstantial, the vow had no concrete promises in it whatsoever, which is why they were able to produce it. There were no specifics about policy in there. But we do know that one of the specifics of the new powers that Scotland was given, in fact, if you ask anybody, if you go into any pub anywhere and you ask anybody, what new powers did Scotland get after the no vote? Ask them. Ask people. See what they say. Something to do with tax. That's what they'll say. And they're right, it was something to do with tax. It was income tax. It was an income tax trap. The reason why income tax was devolved, and no, say, corporation tax, is because income tax harms workers. So if the Scottish Government have to find themselves in a position where they need to raise tax, people can see it in their pay packet that it's been taken from them. And that makes the Scottish Government a very easy target for people's anger when they find themselves getting taxed more. Now, it also leads to a pincer movement because the Scottish Government have got a choice. Well, we either cut services, in which case we get attacked by Labour, or we raise income tax, in which case we get attacked by the Tories. That's the only reason that was devolved. That's the purpose of it. If you actually look at all the things that Labour blocked, and now they're saying, why does the Scottish Government not do something about this? Well, because you blocked the powers that would have allowed the Scottish Government to do something about it. So that is devolution, and obviously we can see the EU withdrawal bill versus the continuity bill that the UK government is attempting to roll back devolution and take control of the Scottish Parliament in a way that we've never experienced in devolution before. Devolution is being threatened. That's what happened as a result of the no vote, because it exposed their vulnerability. This quote from J.K. Rowling here, that's not how power works. That's not how politics works. The losers don't get to dictate terms to the victors. It doesn't happen like that. The only thing that was ever protecting us against Westminster being able to do whatever the hell they want to us, the only thing that's still protecting us from Westminster being able to do whatever the hell they want to us is the threat of independence. Once that threat is finally removed, it's over. We are completely exposed. Scotland has got nothing to bargain with. We've got nothing to defend ourselves with. They could shut Holyrood down overnight and there's nothing we could do about it. And actually that in itself has been exposed by the ruling of the Supreme Court, which concluded that the permanence and the sovereignty of the Scottish Parliament is a fiction, which was another part of the vow, by the way, that the Scottish Parliament is permanent. We've seen how vulnerable the Scottish Parliament now is as a result of that ruling by the Supreme Court. So, another argument, strength and stability. The strength and stability of the UK, I'm just going to let that sit there. Scotland has a seat at the top table as a result of being in the UK. Well, the UK is now friendless internationally. Ireland has more international clout than the UK does, as has been obvious, given that Ireland has the backing of the EU, that the British government can't simply do what the hell they like in Ireland or to Ireland or around Ireland because Ireland has the backing of the EU. That's the sort of clout that Scotland could have if we remained a member of the EU in our negotiations with the UK government. Scotland does not have a seat at the top table, never did. Scotland's outside the room when these discussions are happening at the top table, but the only way Scotland can even conceivably have any kind of influence at the international level is if we vote for independence and remain in the EU. Uncertainty. We heard a lot about uncertainty. There's too many unanswered questions. Wow. The no vote protected us from uncertainty. I'm sure you can agree about that. How many unanswered questions have you got right now about the future direction of the UK? We're in a period of change and instability, that much is obvious. The UK, there's no such thing as the status quo. I think Kirsten referred to this earlier. And even if we can imagine some future horizon where all of this post-Brexit mess settles down, do you think at that point their opponents are going to say, well, now that we're out of that period of stability, let's upend it again by having another independence referendum? Of course not. The only time for a referendum is now, while we're in this transitional period. And we have to let people know that. Let's cross our fingers and hope for a Labour government. That's one of the arguments that were given from the Unionist left. We have to get behind the Labour movement and trust that when a socialist Labour government comes into power, that'll sort us out. And to be quite honest with you, that is, for me, that was always the most persuasive argument that they had as somebody who considers himself a socialist. I must admit I had a wobble when Corbyn came along. Very quickly got over it. But I did have a wobble. I did want to do the job properly and sit down and say, right, okay, what if we do have a Corbyn government? Is that actually the sort of thing that could herald socialism in the UK? Does that actually negate the need for independence? The answer is no. Because, first of all, no Labour government is permanent, as we've seen. We only have to look at the history of the last 100 years in the UK to see that no Labour government is permanent. That there is a very substantial Conservative vote in England that will always put the long-term prospect of a Labour government under threat. But more to the point, faced with the most shambolic government in living memory, against the most inept Prime Minister any of us have ever seen, Corbyn did not win. Now, I remember speaking to Labour activists who were cock-a-hoop at the fact that they didn't even win the general election, but they came close. I was like, you should be in despair right now, because what we've been hearing for you is that once we get rid of the Blairites, and once Labour naturally shifts itself back to the left, the English will realise that this is exactly the sort of Labour government that they need, and they'll elect that government to carry out a socialist programme. It didn't happen. And Corbyn's still not in the lead in the polls, or certainly no in any substantial lead. Certainly any poll that puts him in front, that's always a fragile lead. And he's behind Theresa May in the polling of personal ratings, how people personally rate these candidates. He's behind Theresa May. Let that sink in. I'm not going to put my faith in that. I can't. I want that for England. I want Corbyn for England. Corbyn is exactly the sort of government I think an independent Scotland can do business with. Of course he is. Of course he is. But we're expected to yet again think that Scotland should surrender itself in order to save the English for their own vote. That's a nonsense, because that has not worked out for us in the past. The English have to get their act together. England has to decide what kind of country it is, and that is happening as a result of Brexit and as a result of Corbyn. You'll remember in 2014, suddenly there was these two Scotlands that were looking at each other and saying, who the hell are you? You know, that's, and to a certain extent, still the case. Scotland was forced to have a conversation with itself about the country it's been, the country it is, and the country it could be. England has been complacent for a very long time and no longer is. I think England is now experiencing an identity crisis that could result in a better future for the English people. But that is a conclusion that they will reach by themselves. We can't help them. They'll decide what sort of future they need for themselves, and we'll decide what sort of future we need for us. And Corbyn does not care about Scotland. We're just a bulwark of votes. We heard a great deal about oil, especially after the referendum. That was all we heard about. Well, Scotland has dodged a bullet because the oil price has crashed. We didn't hear a great deal about oil anymore. And there's a reason for that. The oil price has gone back up, and Sir Ian Wood, no less than Sir Ian Wood, is now predicting a second oil boom. So there we are. And by the way, no discussion about oil can be had without talking about the Macron report. I'll not go into it here because I'm guessing most people know about that. But anybody out there watching, Google Macron report and you'll be shocked. The greatest crime perpetrated against the Scottish people by any UK government in living memory. Business, well, all the businesses would leave if we voted yes. Well, Scottish Widows, B&Q, they relocated, shut down their stores. More businesses will go as a result of Brexit. Of that, there can be no doubt. If Scotland stays in the EU, we would be the sort of place that businesses would want to invest in. Pensions, this is the sort of work that Craig's going to do, so I'll not say too much about it, but you know, there's a great deal of that in the book that Commonweal are publishing at the moment. And finally, who's going to want to lead another no campaign? We're in a good position. We've got a solid base of 45%. We've got a renewed case, a renewed prospectus that Commonweal are working on right now, and the opposition's case is in pieces. We should never forget that. They're terrified of another referendum. They've got nothing to gun with right now, and they know it. Thank you.
Okay, folks, just before we take the break, there's a raffle book here. We're not running a raffle, don't worry, you don't need to run away, and a box. Now, if anybody wants to ask a question in the question and answer session, which we'll be doing after tea and coffee, I would ask that you come down here, take a ticket, put the stub of the ticket in the box, and that way the question and answer session will be totally random. Nobody can say, oh, the chairman only invited their pals or whatever. I will not know who's getting drawn out. So if you take one number, put the other copy of the number in the box. The question and answer session will be done at random. If your number's picked, you ask a question. Each panellist will get 1 minute to answer. And then, most importantly, the original questioner will get the final say. They will also get a minute if they want to say they agree or don't agree with what the panel has said in response to their question. The ladies have got tea and coffee ready for you out the door and to the left. And just before we do that, I would just like to say that the fact that we've got 100 people in here on a Wednesday night is a tribute to the power of the panel. It is a tribute to you, and it is a tribute to our amazing Sandra Douglas and John Toms, without whom this would never have happened. And for those of you who know Sandra, she's quite persuasive, and we have our eyes on some very big guests on both sides of the divide coming up in the future. And to that end, we just got today, designed by Alistair Smith, who also designed this banner here. We have membership cards for Yes Eastwood, and this will give you 50% off the Eventbrite price for a year of all future meetings, every monthly meeting. So if anybody wants a membership card to help us fund this group, because this was kind of self-funded by 12 friends who put their own money in initially. Colm Merrick, the gentleman with all the hair and the blue jumper there. If you want to see him during the interval and get yourself signed up for a membership card, it's £10 for a year, but as I say, that will then give you 50% off all future meetings. And that's all. We're going to take a break for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes for tea and coffee. If you just go out that door, turn down to the left, everything's there, loads of buns and donuts and whatever else, and we'll see you in the second half. Thank you.
Even you're having a go. Cheers, man. Aye, good.
The question and answer session of the evening, which I say will be done by the drawing of lots. If I draw your number out, just put your hand up, please, and wait for our friend here to get to you with the roving microphone. Each panellist, you're perfectly at liberty to direct your question to a member of the panel, but each panellist will get 1 minute to answer your point. And then, as I said, most importantly, I will come back to you to hear your opinion of what has been said. So, whoever has a ticket number 11, if you would like to put your hand up. Okay, gentleman up there, if you wait till the microphone comes to you, sir, please.
Good evening, panel. I'll direct this at David. I think we'll just come at you full on, David. You express cynicism for the Scottish independence question, but you failed to express any cynicism for the Union. And as a journalist, do you agree your profession have for decades failed the people of Scotland and continue to do so? They have and are still failing by not challenging the imposition of Henry VIII's laws enshrined in the Great Repeal Bill and rebranded in leaving the EU Bill. The Daily Record's vow, the non-reporting of the Macron report. How does that do for starters?
Okay, so I'll let David address that for 1 minute, and then we'll go around the panel for general views on the journalistic reporting that you were questioning there. I think that's for the rest of the panel as well. So, David, please.
I said I didn't think the Union was perfect, and I went on to identify my views on Trident and all the rest of it. So I don't accept your point that I said nothing against the Union. That's simply untrue. In terms of you want me to defend my profession in the space of 40 seconds, I don't think the media is perfect, but I don't think many of the criticisms levelled against it are at all fair. In the Macron report, just to single it out, the Macron report was a piece of civil service advice. Civil service advice, by its definition, is not made public. The Scottish Government does not routinely publish civil service advice. In fact, it fights very hard to stop it entering the public domain. So the Macron report is a very interesting document, but the idea it was covered up or not reported is just preposterous. It's just not true. It completely misunderstands the nature of confidential civil service advice. It only emerged under FOI much later on, which is the same for a lot of documents swirling around in the Scottish Government at the moment.
Okay, I think since Macron was mentioned, we'll go to Alan next.
Well, we'll not talk about Macron. I'll address the issue of the media. I mean, I think in many ways it's absolutely appropriate and necessary and right that the case for independence should be examined with some scepticism by the media. That's what the media is for. And that, in the end, elucidates all of us. But the problem that I had with the role that the media took in 2014 and still takes is that it wasn't applied to the other side. It just wasn't. There wasn't anything like the same amount of scrutiny. They got a free pass constantly, and that is where I think the charges of bias have come in, and where I think they have a great deal of foundation. Obviously, not everybody in the media. I think there are a lot of media voices out there, even the ones I don't agree with. Sometimes, like David, for example, I'm always interested in what they've got to say because they have an informed viewpoint. Alex Massey is another one I find very interesting, even although he's certainly not pro-independence. But I think that's where, for me, certainly that's where the problems with their media come, is that they're very selective in their scrutiny.
Okay, Kirsten, would you please address the question?
I think it's an interesting question because it probably gets to the heart of something that a number of people do sometimes feel that, it's easy to be a wee bit cynical because it feels sometimes as if the press in general have a different slant to the people that are in our movement. I think there's a few things that lie behind that. It's important for media to be balanced. It's important for them to scrutinise, but it's important also for any country, I think, to have trust in its media and to expect that media to have a view that encompasses the views of the range of people and the range of views within the country. And it doesn't always feel to everyone as if we're there just now, and that's unfortunate because there should be a really positive and strong role for the media in this debate, and as we go forward, it would be good if we could see that. I think that things like David coming here today actually help significantly in that. And the other thing I would just reflect upon is that the media has changed, that there are different kinds of media now, so that there's a lot of new media and people making their own news and sharing their own news, and that's really important too. So I think that we're going forward in a different way.
Thank you. And Craig?
just to echo that final point is that the media has changed in the last 4 years, and the pro-independence sphere does have a louder voice, just in a different way. We do have places like Common Space and Bella Caledonias of the world, and the wider blogosphere, Wings Over Scotland, Wee Ginger Doug, Derek Bateman, and they provide a very insightful voice as well.
Okay, sir, the final word is yours.
I would just refute everything David said. Because I was a member of the BBC bias protests, and the blatant lying by the BBC especially, and the example I'll give you is simply Nick Robinson's report on Alex Salmond's statement that was non-existent in the BBC. That is shameful for any broadcaster. The people rely on broadcasters and journalists to at least balance the argument. The British media, 59 possible newspapers, and out of those 59 papers, we now have one. One given the other side. One. I would dispute the Herald.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
View.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question, ticket number 14, and on the back it says David Henry. Okay, gentleman there, if you just wait for the microphone, please, sir. Thank you.
Hello, this will be interesting. As the panel may know, and maybe the audience knows, the BBC Scotland team are planning to launch a new BBC Scotland TV channel. They have asked for permission to launch it, and this time, for the first time ever, they have to have a licence from Ofcom. No longer is it a BBC decision. Ofcom has so far refused to issue the licence. It's been well reported that the Ofcom is now looking at a number of other issues, including competition. The BBC in Scotland currently attracts over 40% of news viewings in Scotland. So my question for the panel is, while broadcasting is reserved in Westminster, should we campaign to block any new Unionist-controlled BBC channels?
Okay. Right, so in the interest of fairness, I will go in the reverse order where the panel answered last time. So that will be Craig first, please.
I can't pretend to be an expert in the specifics of this particular instance. I'm not generally in favour of blocking media unless there's a very, very good reason to do it. So I think we should be encouraging more broadcasting from and for Scotland. You should embrace opportunity and help things to be as best they can. And if they go wrong, try and encourage them. And if they still go wrong, then complain about them. Give them the chance.
Okay, Kirsten, please.
Thanks. I think it's interesting that the question doesn't stray quite so far from the first one, which perhaps tells us something about the areas that people are interested in. I think that the role of the regulator is important. It would be useful to work out, whether the regulator's working as it should. Is it doing what it needs to do? Are all these services providing the value that they should do for money? I think, though, my overarching view is that the more media that we have, the better. The more variety we have, the better, and the more balance to make sure that it is something that will represent the interests and the views of as many people as possible. And I would maybe reflect back to some of the things that some of you may have heard Leslie Riddick talking about in the Nordic countries, where the variety and the scope of their media is so much greater than ours, and that's something that we should all aspire to.
Thank you. Alan?
I certainly sympathise with people's frustrations about the BBC. I mean, the clue's in the name, obviously, and it's in their charter that they're there to promote the cohesion of the UK. I'm not entirely convinced that they're aware of their own biases. I don't think they necessarily believe that they have an agenda and that they are actively trying to promote that agenda. But nonetheless, you only have to scrutinise some of the output to see that there is a disproportionate focus on certain areas, and there's no getting away for that. One thing I would say, well, two things. One is, I don't know how much time we should spend in future campaigns on the issue of the media, because there's no getting away from it. No matter how many times we protest outside Pacific Quay, it's not going to make any difference. And actually, there are better ways that we could be using our time. We just have to get around the media, using our own media and using things like this, forums like this, the internet, and good old conversation. The other thing I would say is that as somebody who has had experience from the inside of the BBC, I work with the BBC quite a lot, it's very obvious to me that the place is not stuffed with Unionists, Pacific Quay. There are a great many people in there who are yes voters, who also share some of the frustrations that a lot of us have. You know, it's not a Unionist bloc by any means. So I think we need to introduce a little bit of shades of grey in there.
Okay, thank you. And David?
Yeah, as Alan says, anyone who's familiar with BBC Scotland would not recognise the caricature of this sort of Unionist bloc. There's a wide range of views there. To answer your specific question, should there be an attempt made to block any new TV channel? No.
Okay, and the final word is with you, sir.
Well, I take on board most of it. My angle on this is I've set up an online petition, which it will go into Ofcom next month. I've got experience dealing with Ofcom regulations, so I know for a fact the BBC is not complying with Ofcom's impartiality rules. My concern is not that the BBC is full of Unionists, but it has proven itself in the last few years, to my surprise, to be honest, because I'm an independent producer and I know what the rules are. During the referendum, they blatantly broke the rules. They broke their own rules. And there is two explicit examples of this.
You've only got 10 seconds left. Said a minute each.
Okay. One was obviously the Alex Salmond thing, but more importantly, and I think more blatantly obvious as propaganda, was the Vote No Borders reports of a group that didn't exist and had no members. None of these questions were ever raised, and there was no action taken against the BBC afterwards. And so therefore, I would argue that people should be pushing their views to Ofcom to ask for Ofcom to do a full review of the BBC's plans, because I don't think we can trust them to be impartial.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so number 4, who has ticket number 4? Okay, gentleman over here, if you just wait for the microphone to come to you, sir, please.
I'd like to give a very topical question to any member of the panel. I'm not really bothered to. As you know, unfortunately today, Professor Stephen Hawking died. He was very clever, and he predicted that the time would come when the universe stops expanding, and time would start going backwards. Now that the Brexiteers are in charge of London, and they want to take us back to the Victorian era of no workers' rights, blatant racism, poor health, no pensions, and no health service, my question to any member of the panel is, do they agree that Stephen Hawking was correct? Time is going back.
Okay, I think we'll just we'll start with Alan and work our way down to the end there.
Yes.
Put me on the spot now. I'm a physicist by training, and Hawking was one of my heroes, and his contribution to science, his contribution to bringing people to the craft has earned him a sense of immortality. So he'll be sorely, sorely missed. I don't know what else to say about that, to be honest. You know, things come in cycles, so maybe we can push things forward again.
Okay, David?
Well, if time starts moving backwards, presumably we'll get back to the early 18th century, which I imagine some of you would be quite pleased about.
And Kirsten, please.
It was actually quite a sad house in my house this morning when I woke my 2 wee boys up and told them that Stephen Hawking had died. And I think that's actually the key thing for me in all of this. What you say is true, and it's also pretty funny, but the serious bit is that Stephen Hawking did an amazing job in interesting people in science, and one of the things that we will absolutely need to do as we go forward and in an independent Scotland is we need young people to be inspired and interested in science. So I think he'll certainly be sadly missed.
And final word with you, sir.
Thank you. As I said, it's a sad occasion because obviously the chap was very clever. But unfortunately, with the folk that's now in charge of Westminster, the Brexiteers and all the hangers-on and all their pals, that unfortunately, I think Stephen Hawking could be right. We could be going back to one of these Victorian conditions for all, apart from the elite few.
Okay, thank you. Okay, ticket number 7. Okay, if you could wait for the microphone to come to you, sir, please.
Hi there. I was going to ask the panel, back in the 2014 referendum, Better Together campaign ran a campaign of, you're better, we're better together, you can't do this, you can't do that on your own. And what I was going to ask was, what do you think their approach would be in the next referendum? Where would they come from? Because obviously everything that they had said then has now been completely flipped on its head. Everything that they said, would be true has become, it's not true, and vice versa. So that was my question to the panel.
Okay, we'll go in the opposite direction we went last time. So Kirsten, if you would like to start us off, please.
I don't know, is the honest answer. I don't know whether it would follow the same path as Brexit, which would suit me fine, because if anybody approached a referendum as ineptly as the UK government approached Brexit, then that would certainly be helpful for us. But I seriously don't know how people would approach it. I do agree with you, though, that an awful lot of the things that were said to us in 2014, things that were put across as if they were true, as if they were fact, and of course they weren't. They were pieces of information that were designed to make people think in a particular way, have been proven with time, and hindsight's a wonderful thing, but they've been proven not to be factually correct. So that's an interesting thing, and maybe it'd be worth thinking about some of the things that Alan said as we go forward, that we can reflect on the things that proved not to be the case. But my interest is really much more in what we do and what we think as we go forward to the next referendum.
Thank you. David?
As I think I said earlier, I think it would be quite difficult for Better Together Mark II for all sorts of reasons, not just in terms of personnel, but in some of the arguments. And Alan made some good points earlier. I didn't agree with all of it. But both campaigns made overblown claims. That is the nature of politics. It's particularly the nature of referendums. The Yes campaign, for example, said the NHS in Scotland would be privatised with a no vote, the Barnett formula would be scrapped, and the EU membership would be automatic. All of those are not necessarily true either. So there is no virtue in politics. Both sides make overblown claims. That is how these campaigns are fought.
Okay, Craig?
Again, I don't know what arguments they will make, but I can tell you how I would hope that they would run. Last time around, you could fairly say that there was an argument where the Yes side was arguing for change versus a form of status quo. But it's becoming obvious now that the next campaign is going to be about two different futures. So I would hope that they would present that future from as they see it and allow us to analyse it as we see it, as they will do with our campaign.
I think the key word there, Craig, is hope. I think their arguments in the next referendum will centre on trade, the fact that Scotland has more trade with the UK than it does with the EU, that they'll talk about that, and in order to preserve a cohesive internal UK market. Obviously that forgets the fact that Scotland could then open its trade further with the rest of the EU. But anyway, that'll be one of them. Another one will be much the same as it did the last time. In a period of great uncertainty, Why would you add more uncertainty? You know, get used to hearing that. And I think one of the other things that they'll do, to be quite honest, because they'll be wanting to target yes voters who voted leave, is they will probably introduce the subject of immigration. And I think Blair McDougall has already hinted at this. I think he sent a tweet out saying he thinks it will be difficult for the topic of immigration to be avoided the next time around, which I think is probably a bellwether that they will focus on that. Yes voters who actually don't like immigration and try and pick those up from us.
Okay, final words to yourself, sir.
Aye, I think some of David's points have yet to be proven, because obviously with the 20 or the 25 powers looking to be held by Westminster, that could change things dramatically for our health service and for fracking and everything else. I take on some of Alan's points that they probably would go down the road of the UK internal market, etc., etc. But again, this is where we need to get our information, because I think in the last referendum, what frustrated me the most was the lack of detail and clarity. You get sound bites from both sides, but there was never really any substantive, answers. People weren't given proper information on both sides. And I do agree with the SNP's white paper was too big, too convoluted, and was basically a manifesto. Went into too many different areas, fingers in too many different pies.
Okay, right, thank you. So, ticket number 8. Who is this one? Right, okay, if you could just wait for the microphone, sir, so we can all hear you.
Thanks very much. Steve Webster, Armadale SNP, just for information. I'd like to pick up on something you said, Alan, about Ireland's status in the world. I mean, if we contrast Ireland with Wales, similar size, similar population, Ireland has all the levers to attract inward investment. I mean, Microsoft's just announced a flagship opening of a building there to employ 2,000. There's banking, there's high tech, there's American corporations going there, because Ireland has this ability to attract them. I can't think the last time Scotland attracted a single damn thing except a Lidl's metal shed, and we were arguing over whether North Lanarkshire was going to get it or West Lothian Council area. So I look at what we've got here and contrast this position that Wales has with Ireland just across the water, and Scotland's in a similar sort of situation in this great historic union of, the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, unable to push any levers or press any buttons when it most needed. Can you imagine the news it would be?
Do we have a question for the panel, sir?
Okay, it's a contract. It's really the point. I would like some comments on the lack of us in Scotland to attract Siemens to open a train factory, or international banks to come to Edinburgh, which is now a basket case in terms of its industries over there, and others like Dublin.
Okay, Alan, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Ireland's a very good example. The point I was making earlier is that politically it has more weight now than the UK, and economically it's still tied to the EU, and which makes it attractive to business. I think we could have that future for Scotland with independence, but we should also not take our eye off the ball and just let it be a sort of, in you come, do what the hell you like, pay minimum wages, the government's going to subsidise you. We have to be very careful about what we mean by inward investment. It has to be the sort of investment that actually benefits the people of Scotland rather than just benefits financiers.
Okay, Craig?
Yeah, I'm a little bit sceptical when people start touting inward investment, because quite often it means some multinational company coming in, buying one of our small or medium enterprises, then selling it off or moving it out. So one of the ideas that Commonweal's been really pushing, it's been one of our big success stories from 2016, was the idea of a Scottish National Investment Bank. We produced a lot of these ideas, and it's now part of the Scottish Government's programme. It's about to get funded to £340 million. Now that's something we can do just now, and we can use that to boost our own investment, our own upward investment from Scotland. Obviously, if we've got more powers over independence, particularly more powers over borrowing, then we can rapidly expand these banks and really accelerate that programme. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Okay, thank you. David?
I mean, actually echoing the previous two speakers, you have to be careful what you wish for. The Irish economic model is a very specific and successful, in certain respects, model, but it's not predicated on high wages for most people. It's not predicated on sort of strong social security and protection in that sense. And businesses are often attracted by the fact that is not part of it. So you have to be very careful with that. The wider point on economic growth is it's something every government devolved or reserved for the past 40 years has struggled with. The Conservatives in the 1980s, Labour after that, and the SNP for the past 10 years. And I absolutely accept they don't have all the levers, but even with the sort of reserve powers, the SNP to me have never been very good at articulating what they would do even with the power. They can't really get beyond saying we need the power, but they don't say what they would do with it. So I think economic growth is extremely challenging, and independence in itself doesn't improve that.
Okay, thank you. And Kirsten?
Maybe to start where David finished. I'm switched on. I think it's an interesting argument that he's putting forward that the Scottish Government or that the SNP are looking for powers but not saying what they would do with them. I think that's slightly confused in terms of the logic there. It's, I think, undeniable that with the greater economic powers, Scotland would be able to make choices. So the powers aren't predicated on putting forward your choice first. It's important that we have the opportunity to make changes to our economy that will benefit the people of Scotland. And I'm really pleased that Craig spoke about the Scottish National Investment Bank. I think that's absolutely key. I've been looking a lot at that over the past couple of weeks, and this is something that could make a significant difference to our economy in a sustainable way. And that's vital going forward, because that's what's going to make the changes in our communities. That's what's going to drive sustainable benefit into our towns and villages across Scotland. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes, but certainly the additional powers that we seek would mean that we could make a significantly bigger difference.
Okay, thank you. And final words to you, sir.
I think if the Republic of Ireland was still part of the UK, it would be as poor as Wales is today.
Okay, right, folks, we're going to do one more question and then do the wrap-up. But before I do that, I've been asked by Councillor Angela Convery, by the way, if she can have the microphone for a couple of minutes. She's got something she wants to let you all know about, and we'll also put the details of it up on our Facebook page. So, Angela, you've got 2 minutes, and then I'm going to move on to the final question, please.
Hi, I'm very sorry I've been drawing the short straw to try and explain this that I've been carrying about with me. So I'm just going to start. So I'm from the Yes G78 group, and last night we had an Indie App training session, and we also had Mike Fennick from the Scottish Hand who came along, and he's asked the Yes G78 group to take part in his group rally speech, and that's by handing in coins that are in these bottles and completing the forums that I've got. He started off by using the quote that's used against us all the time: Scotland is too wee, too poor and too stupid. So Scotland's got over 5 million people, whereas you've got Ireland, who's got 350,000, and they've got their own currency. East Renfrewshire has got about 150,000 population. You've got the Isle of Man, so it's got 75,000. They've got their own currency. You've got the population of Neilston, the wee village, 5,000. You've got the population of the Falkland Islands, about 5,000. They've got their own currency. So what he has done is he's done this 8 times so far. He is handing these coins and these completed forms in to Holyrood and asking the First Minister to keep them for safeguarding to use towards Scotland's central bank. So in the years to come, when we are independent, and the next generation will be able to look back on these signed forums and they can see their families have took part in this, and this could be the start of our new declaration of Arbroath. Now, I'm not very good at explaining this by any stretch of the mean, but there is a YouTube video where he goes into in great depths. So if anybody wants to sign these forums and stick a wee coin with 10 pence, 50 pence, we'll wait outside at the table.
Okay, thank you, Angela.
Or a pound.
Right, folks, we're going to do one more question and then we have to wrap up, I'm afraid. So number 15. 15, who has 15? Okay, lady there, if you just wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Okay, I have two questions, so hopefully that's...
You only get one.
Okay, they kind of lead into each other. So firstly, do you believe that the UK government are trying to underplay the impact that Brexit is going to have in businesses due to likely various hard borders between the UK, Ireland and Europe? Secondly, in 2014, it was strongly asserted that there would be a hard border between Scotland and the rest of the UK if it were to be independent. Do you believe that argument still stands?
Okay, I think we'll start with Kirsten then and work our way down to Alan, please. Thanks.
Thanks for that. If I heard you correctly, I think you were wondering if the UK government was trying to undermine or underplay maybe the impact of Brexit on business. Yeah, well, maybe they are. That would be understandable because I think that there are significant concerns, valid significant concerns about what Brexit will mean for the economy, for business, for individual people. So I suppose they may not want to make too much of that. It strikes me that businesses have possibly done more of a risk assessment of Brexit than perhaps the UK government has, which is a sad indictment on them. And in terms of the border, well, with the trials and tribulations that the UK government are going through with the Irish border question at the moment, I think that makes it a really stark question to answer. No, I don't think for a second that there would be a hard border of the nature of the one that was proposed during the 2014 referendum. I don't think that at all.
Thank you. David?
Yes, they are trying to underplay it. But at the same time, they have published projections for the 3 different scenarios. So I think it's single market membership and whatever the other 2 were. They get worse and worse. But the figures are there, and they're pretty bleak in each scenario, so they can only underplay it so much. The border is incredibly difficult, but the crucial point is that in Ireland, if the Republic is in the single market and Northern Ireland is not, then you need some sort of border. It might not be very hard, but there has to be something. And it's directly applicable, well, not directly applicable, but it raises a similar issue with the mainland. If, as the First Minister has suggested, Scotland stays in the single market and England is not in the single market, and likewise with the customs union, you need something. And it may not be that hard. It may be pretty routine. But the point is, I don't think there's much to be gained from claiming, as some do, that there would be no border whatsoever. Northern Ireland actually demonstrates how tricky that is.
Okay, Craig, please.
This is where I wish I had my maps and my spreadsheets and I could draw you a nice matrix of all the different scenarios. Yeah, the claim last time round that there would be no border between Scotland and England was based on the fact that both Scotland and England would be part of the EU and part of the common travel area. I think now we need to face the fact that the border between Scotland and England will likely be no harder and no softer than the eventual border arrangement between Ireland and Northern Ireland. I think we just need to face that now. So we should be looking over there to see what kind of deal that they end up striking. I should also say, and this is another bit of critical self-reflection, when the Scottish Government's kind of saying, well, if Northern Ireland gets a special deal to stay in the single market, therefore Scotland should get one too. I mean, yeah, it's a claim that if you want a differentiated agreement, and you can argue the merits of that differentiated agreement, but just remember that a special deal to keep Northern Ireland in the single market would be, the purpose of that would be to avoid a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Doing it in Scotland would create one. So there may still be merit in making that argument, but to do it just solely on the border issue, maybe look into the detail of that.
I've got to be quite honest, we had to understand enough about international law to be able to answer that question about the border with any real confidence, but I think the panel have probably given you enough to go in there. Just before the end, though, I'm going to really cheekily and glibly plug my one-woman show. The Moira Monologues, which is on in Paisley Arts Centre on the 8th of April.
Okay, and the final word goes to you, madam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Who knows? We'll find out soon.
Okay, you'll notice that Alan was quite quick with the plug there. It's obviously something he's done before. He moved faster than Ruth Davidson sampling a postal vote there. So folks, thanks for coming along tonight. It's been fantastic. As I say, 104 people turned up tonight, which is absolutely amazing and is a credit to you all and to the fantastic panel that we had here tonight. I hope you all enjoyed it. A big thanks to everybody. I have to say again, John Tom, Sandra Douglas, who facilitated this whole thing, Kenny Lowe, who did the tickets, Alistair Smith, who's done all the graphics for the membership cards and the board here, all the fantastic guys at Indie Live, our cameraman, our sound guys here. Thanks to all of you. Keep an eye, yes, Eastwood on Facebook. We have big things coming, believe you me. Thanks to everybody who joined. The funds make all the difference to help us moving forward. And on the subject of membership, we would like to bestow honorary membership of Yes Eastwood to our 4 speakers tonight. So, Alan, for Craig, for David, and for Kirsten. Thanks for coming. Good night. See you next time.